You're listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
And we've got our good friend David Pietrusza, a wonderful historian and author in his own right, joining us right now. And it's fantastic. You know, we see the new President Bush Library. We saw the collection of past and current presidents get together for its opening, and it brings us the interesting questions of, well, if we look back at how Americans past and present view, say George Bush, which is very interesting. Towards the end of the Bush presidency, his ratings weren't very high, let's leave it at that. But it seems to me that they've been on an upward trend, that they kind of view some of the things and decisions he made as a little differently today than they did, say, even 2 years ago or 5 years ago. And so we have David Pietrusza with us to discuss some of these ideas. So welcome, David. It's a pleasure.
Good to be back.
So if we take George Bush, 43, and we look at how Americans will judge him in history, it seems to me that the trend is improving since he left office till now, and I think it'll consider to do so over time. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's been quite remarkable that after 4 years in which he's laid very low by any standards, that we see not just one but two polls come out where he's bounced back from the slough of despond to basically within a statistical margin of error for break even. And I guess we have to posit that to the fact that if he was so bad, why hasn't it gotten better? And so the American people may be asking that. Not enough of them asked that last November, but perhaps finally we're getting a delayed reaction on that.
Well, that's a good thing. I feel that I don't love, obviously, some of the decisions that either Bush made, actually, but specifically Bush 43. But I did think that what was it, 8 months he was in office, or that when 9/11 happened, it was maybe 10 months. It was. I mean,
Sure.
It was so new to his presidency to have to just be thrown into something completely unexpected. It really changed the course of his entire presidency. I'm sure everything that he had planned to do and to initiate was thrown out the door, except for maybe the Medicare drug prescription drug plan which I can't stand either. But I'm just saying.
Well, his tax cuts as well. His tax cuts.
Yeah. So it's just a very
that changed the. He inherited balanced budgets and has to throw that out the window because that's what balanced budgets get thrown out the window in wartime. Even if you raise taxes were raised remarkably during World War I, World War II, and still you had to have the Liberty bonds, you had to have the savings bonds, you had to have massive borrowing and debt to finance them. However, what you also had was, I think you're referring to, is the explosion in domestic spending during the Bush years, where Nancy Reagan said, just say no, and George W. Bush really never said no to the excesses of Congress in those years.
Yeah, it's a very fair point. In fact, if it wasn't for the conservatives and the Tea Party-minded people, and I mean real conservatives, not just those who put a label in front of their name and act differently, if it wasn't for us, I would suspect that the Republican Party, along with the Democrats, would just be on this endless spending spree.
I think so. I think it has been a grassroots thing. I mean, the canard that you see that the Tea Party is an AstroTurf situation is ludicrous. The AstroTurf situation is that many of the so-called activists you see, such as the people who stopped me in New York City on the street yesterday afternoon, are bought and paid for, who are employees of these really corporations, so-called not-for-profit corporations, but corporations which are activists for profit. And the Tea Party is not. It really is just regular folks who probably have never been out there before. Where I think they sort of went downhill was they sort of went to sleep again after 2010. But a number of things have served to waken them up, including the election last November. But also, I think that the gun control issue has been extremely powerful in New York State. It has served to remarkably reduce the ratings of Governor Andrew Cuomo, who had been in the stratosphere in terms of approval, and now he's been brought down to earth. And I think around the country, the other politicians see that. They see that badly crafted regulations, which serve really merely to harass law-abiding gun owners, that there is a price to be paid for it politically, and they don't want to pay it.
Well, David, I think what happened, in my opinion, is 50% of the country realized that while we may be paranoid about liberals, that doesn't mean they're not actually out to get us.
They certainly are.
So one of the things I want to share, and I find this fascinating, no matter what you think about an individual president, every time you have a library or sometimes, unfortunately, a funeral, it's one of those rare moments where you get 3 to 5 and on extremely rare occasions more presidents that are alive together, or ex-presidents, of course. But when you look at these presidents sitting there, one of the things that struck me is how different they are in a very fundamental building block of character. You know, Bush during his era, really was if it was things that went wrong, right, it was about fighting Russia and communism, right? Bill Clinton could blame God for providing too many beautiful women or not so beautiful women surrounding him, right? Carter blamed America. Bush blamed radical Islam. And, of course, the president who's in here now blames Bush or America, or in some cases even the Constitution. And I wanted to point out an example of what I mean by that and how that translates to governance. And I wanted your opinion on this. Look at what Reagan did when the air traffic controllers basically threatened America's critical transportation infrastructure as a weapon for personal gain. Reagan said, no way, no how, not on my watch, and he fired them and brought in military and other guys to replace them. Obama does the opposite. A small decrease in spending, which really is not so much a decrease in spending. Of course, sequestration is really about a cut in what was an increased spending. And he's trying to punish. He's finding every way possible, it seems, to publicly punish Americans for not accepting any and all tax increases that he wants to bring upon us. And isn't that such a profound explanation for what the real character of a man is? And I want to do your opinion on that.
It's a very political and cynical individual who would do that, and would do it over and over again. But he does it over and over again because he basically gets away with it, because he is enabled by a media which never questions any of this, and enabled by a population which is as long as you have any D after your name, will excuse anything you do. I mean, whether that probably is around 47% right now. And for what reason it is 47 or not, I'll let Mitt Romney argue, but that's pretty much it. We're a very divided nation at this point, and it is a question of if you can win those independents over or not. And when you do, you're barely. You have a very small majority, either side. Even Obama last November, that was painted as some sort of a great landslide. It was not. A landslide is 55%. He got 52, 53%, and in fact was the first president elected to a second term maybe ever who got less of a vote than his first time out.
Which is particularly ironic because this was an individual who built his cachet on his charisma, right? It wasn't a track record. It surely wasn't his track record in the Senate. You know, we were lucky if he showed. Well, maybe not. Maybe we were lucky he didn't show up so often. David, when you go back and you reflect upon, again, go back to the image in your head of that group of presidents, one of the things that strikes me is presidents, like any other human, could be driven by internal or external influence. And I think there's a profound difference there. Even if you disagree with somebody's politics, if they're driven by internal influences, you at least might feel they're a man of conviction. If they're driven by external influences, you have to actually question their loyalty. So I wanted to get your opinion or your sense of how particularly this group of recent presidents, and maybe if there's a historical reference to compare to, who you think maybe was a great, successful president because they had a powerful internal influence, and maybe somebody else. And Carter, of course, comes to mind as somebody who you really have to question even their loyalty because their influences seem to be highly externalized to the interest of the country.
Well, I would hesitate to characterize any of the presidents who were there yesterday as great presidents. They have pretty much... Clinton's presidency looks better to the American people simply because of the luck of when he held it. That there was a peace dividend, and he was also lucky enough to have a wife who pushed a Medicare reform or a medical care reform that the American people didn't want, that caused the Congress or the House of Representatives to go Republican and forced Clinton to deal with Newt Gingrich and welfare reform. This aided the economy, aided the central cities of the country, brought in fiscal restraint. So you had fiscal restraint, and you had peace, none of which were really Clinton's doing. He merely sort of presided over it and was there. The other presidents, very mixed bags at best, going to the outright horrible.
Now, if you go back and you think about that from a historical context, I'll just say one quick thing on Clinton. I think it's also critical to state that he was fortunate that this digital transformation hit right smack early on in his presidency, where all of a sudden the internet, the World Wide Web.
Well, yes, and you're the technical person and not me, but I have had a theory for a while that as a lot of the carryover or transition to computers in offices and businesses in America kind of occurred really under Bush 41, okay? And the payback which Americans got for that, a handheld calculator cost $700, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It was very expensive stuff which did not deliver hardly any bang for the buck until Clinton got in, and there was not only a peace bonus, but there was a technology bonus which had been paid for under Bush, and which I think helped to slow down his economy. I don't know, stop me if you've ever heard that one.
No, I think it's actually a very interesting perspective, and it goes to the final question I had on my end for you today, David, I think we very often it's difficult to judge a president sometimes when they're in office. If they're grievous mistakes like we think this current president does, that's one thing. But I think very often we just are, we're a world of cycles, right? Everything, the tides, everything moves in waves. And very often what happens is you put forth effort now, you build a foundation, it manifests itself when you're not even in there. And so it's hard always to even be intellectually honest about what immediate impact the current president has versus good or bad, what the prior president did and set up. And in that case, you could maybe give a little bit of early credibility to the current president's blaming of Bush, not necessarily for everything he's done. So the question for you is, when you look back at presidents historically, we opened the show talking about how Bush is starting to look a little better in people's eyes, especially because Obama stayed with so many of his policies that he railed against when he ran for office. Were there particular presidents that strike you as maybe one that seemed really good in office, and 20, 30, 50 years later on reflection, we realized, boy, he really was not good for the country. And conversely, maybe one who, we really didn't appreciate, and looking back historically, we realized what a transformational or uniting or some other really meaningful value that he brought to the nation as a whole.
Well, we've seen two reputations rise quite a bit in the last few decades. Truman and Eisenhower. Truman was particularly unpopular when he left office. Eisenhower wasn't, but the historians and the smart crowd would dismiss Eisenhower as sort of a pleasant boob. And their reputations have both risen quite a bit. Kennedy's reputation is interesting. If so much of his continuing popularity, I guess, is the nostalgia which results from the assassination and such like that. And as this generation disappears and people are left with actually looking with the accomplishments of his administration, I wonder if he will fade back to earth. Generally, and also there is interest, not necessarily popularity or ratings, but sheer interest in a presidency. For a long time, Franklin Roosevelt was the Roosevelt you watched, and then for the last couple decades, although the Depression has caused a renewed interest in Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal, but Theodore Roosevelt, not so much because of his presidency, I think, but because of the sheer force of his personality, has become such a cultural icon, and has been, at least in the book publishing world.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think Theodore is an interesting person to follow. Just as I think Bill Clinton's more interesting to follow now. It's just because of his personality than he is because of anything he really did politically. In fact,
he is slick. He's very good at what he does.
But he makes for a very good used car salesman.
Yes.
It's interesting because I think when you look at the presidencies, I think a lot of them can be defined not just by the president, but the people that they have as advisors. And right now, I look at David Axelrod as, and even before him, Rahm Emanuel, as a lot of the personality behind Barack Obama. And I guess if you looked at Bush, you could probably point to Karl Rove and a few others. But none of these are individuals that really align with my thinking or perception of what we should be doing. But they drive their agendas. I just don't think that they're viewed by Americans as necessarily good for us.
Well, yes, and it's talking about the people behind the presidents and how maybe Rove, and Rove was not derided but praised in a sort of sarcastic way as Bush's brain. There were a couple of fellows from the Bush administration who preceded me on FoxNews.com live yesterday when I was talking about presidential reputations, and their discussion was very interesting. And they were making the point that when you watched Bush and Cheney actually in person, live, behind the scenes, that they sort of swapped personalities, and that Bush acted like someone who had actually graduated from Harvard Business School and was a very tough taskmaster with a great eye for detail and just one tough hombre. So it's easy to often dismiss a president or a leader. We're always looking for the story behind the story. And sometimes the story is simply that these guys are leaders and, for good or ill, exhibited the management and leadership skills which got them to that office.
Yeah, it's a very good point. I find it interesting when I thumb through the different channels trying to pay attention to what's going on in the world of politics. So if I turn on Fox, all too often I have to listen to Karl Rove on Sean Hannity's program or some of the others. And quite frankly, I'm tired of listening to any of these people because I feel like they've misdirected this nation for, and you said it yourself earlier, I think if you viewed all the presidents that were at the library yesterday, none of them are anyone that we could really be so proud of. And, oh my gosh, it's just like, we need a new dialogue. We need a new, not just, the apparent leadership, meaning the people out in front, but the people behind the scenes need to be changed as well. And I want to throw one other thing out there. When you look at members of Congress, we often change the congressmen, but the people in Washington, D.C. who work in their offices get recycled from office to office to office, which is why we see old bills reappearing in the future and so on and so forth.
Which is the danger. You know, we rail against liberals and unintended consequences of legislation, et cetera, et cetera. One of the unintended consequences of term limits might be government by permanent staff. People arrive and they become pawns of a permanent staff on either side of the aisle. Really, the Washington establishment gets even more to be of the Washington establishment. So yes, there is that danger of that. We have the permanent punditocracy. You see the same people appearing on talk shows for 20 or 30 years, it seems, and certainly people on public radio never go off. Hello, Garrison Keillor, go away.
Yeah, in that respect, there's certain networks it's hard to believe that they're still being propped up by the corporations because they've got to be losing money. I mean, you can't exist with an audience of one. Well, David, I want to thank you so much for your time today, and as always, it's a pleasure. And I'll give you the opportunity to direct our listeners to where they could find some of your wonderful books.
Well, Amazon or BarnesandNoble.com. My books have been on presidential history and elections, 1920, 1960, and 48. Punch those numbers in. It's easier than spelling my name. Or just punch in Calvin Coolidge. I've got a bunch of books on him.
Great. Well, again, it's a pleasure, and we'll speak with you soon. Have a great weekend.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right, take care. And that's, of course, author and historian David Pietrusza. And, of course, I've got in my hand one of his books, 1960, LBJ versus JFK versus Nixon. Excellent read, as are all of his books. So please check him out on Amazon and order a couple. Do him a favor. He'd appreciate it.